All right, let's get started. This is the 8th of January, the end of the first week, and today I'd like to talk briefly about a couple of issues brought up in the two readings assigned for this week. I wanted to get us started with the evolutionary process, and most of you probably have some familiarity with the evolutionary process so far throughout your education. But I wanted to try to demolish or dispel a few of the most common misunderstandings of how the evolutionary process works. Evolution is central to biology. Nothing in biology, as the biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky said in 1973, nothing in biology makes sense without evolution. And that's a critically important statement. It is the explanatory device for everything in biology, from DNA, from the molecular basis of biology, to population ecology, the study of macro scale, large scale things, and also small scale, micro scale things, DNA. So for this whole suite, from DNA to population dynamics and population ecology, evolutionary principles are what guide us as modern scientists in our thinking about the phenomenon of life. What is life? How does it propagate? How does it change through time? Now, of course, that applies to the Neanderthals as well, which are the focus of our course. And to understand our Neanderthals, then, we need to understand the biological process of evolution. But there are some misconceptions that are floating around out there that we need to take care of. There are only 4 in here, but these are pretty important ones. There are 4 in here that I really go after, one being the idea that evolution is simply a theory. That's a misconception. In fact, it's based in a popular understanding of what we mean by theory and fact and so on, and you can read about it in here. By the way, just in the last, about a year ago, the science journal Nature, we'll be reading a number of items from the journal Nature. It had an editorial, it carried an editorial that said, evolution is a fact and educators must communicate it as a fact. And in fact, that has prompted me to start a new book project, which is called a book called The Fact of Evolution. Not theory, not idea, not concept, it is a fact. Anyway, it's central to biology, so this is why I wanted to make sure that we get off on the right foot with evolution. It's not just a theory, it is a fact. Another concept, a common misconception, is that it is somehow internally driven, that the evolutionary process strives to go from one thing to another to another. In the mass media, it's not surprising that people carry that, because in the mass media, it's almost always communicated or implied that the evolutionary process is climbing a ladder. They said that the next stage of evolution and the next accomplishment of the evolutionary process was such and such. In retrospect, we can look at a species and say that yes, it started out simpler and became more complex, let's say, or not very well adapted to its environment, became very well tailored to its environment by evolution over time. And in retrospect, we can say yes, that's progress. But the evolutionary process, as you can read about it in the third reading that I gave, which was optional and covers the way that I teach evolution, that process is blind. It does not see into the future. And in fact, the word evolution is something that we use to describe the cumulative results of 3 completely independent facts. The fact that life forms have offspring, the fact that those offspring are not identical, they have variations, and the fact that those variable offspring vary in their survival, and they pass on the characteristics. Those who are better suited or have variations that are better suited to their environment, they pass those characteristics on to the next generation. So these are independent facts: replication, variation, and selection, and the cumulative result of those 3 is what we call evolution. So the idea that it's internally driven or that there's some sort of plan to it and so on is simply false as well. You can read The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins, in which he describes the complexity of this great, staggering complexity of how evolution, a blind, directionless process, goes from essentially, or builds things and tailors them over time, such that it appears, it's a grand illusion, it appears that you begin with this thing that's very simple, and it is perfectly made for its environment. yes, it's perfectly made for its environment, but by the processes of replication, variation, and selection, and not by some internal clockwork, some internal engine trying to perfect the species for some purpose. The concept of a missing link, critically important for Neanderthals because we're looking at fossil material a great deal. In this class we'll look at all kinds of evidence. But the concept of missing links has to do, and you can read the paper, has to do with the concept of what a species is and is not. Can we identify species in the fossil record? That kind of thing. The concept of only the strong survive, or survival of the fittest. Also very prevalent in the mass media is the concept that all species are at war with one another and essentially they are competing for survival. That's true enough, but it's the idea that only physical fitness or physical brute strength is the only characteristic that allows a species to survive. Well, in that paper we go through and show that that's not the case either. In fact, it turns out it is the subtlety of thinking, the ability to discern great distinctions and subtleties that appears to make the modern human survive and survive as opposed to the Neanderthals. Neanderthals were brutally strong, very capable creatures. They lived 270,000 years, but then they become extinct. Who replaces them? Modern humans. We are comparatively frail. So the concept that brute strength is what achieves or wins out in the evolutionary process, at least in this Neanderthal case, that's simply not the case. So, okay, some misconceptions about evolution, quite important. The other paper was, as one student wrote in an email to me, very boring, and I agree. And this is the reason we're not going to read these kind of papers very much. Now, of course, it's important to be conversant with or to be able to handle this kind of material, which is a very technical, dry report on the discovery of some stone tools dated to the Neanderthal period in Greece. We'll come around to all the chronologies and so on later on. And in fact, tomorrow I'll post a video about all the study material, the background material for Neanderthal Europe. But this is a very typical report. It's from 1963. It doesn't matter. A very typical report on the nature of some stone tools. Now, stone tools are a critically important component of Neanderthal studies. In all of the Stone Age studies of Europe, stone tools are important. And that's because hominids left so many stone tools behind. Well, we'll get deeply into what stone tools are, how they're produced. I'll even do some video of how we make them or how hominids make them and use them to survive. But it's a very technical report and it just describes how these what was discovered. We have gone through in the field of anthropology and archaeology about a 100-year period of description. We are now coming to, I believe, in a historical sense, we're now coming to a point in anthropology and archaeology of what we would call explanation. We've done 150 years of racking up the basic chronology. What happened, when, and where. Now we have enough information, I think, that we can start to do explanations. That's really fascinating, and that's where we're going with the rest of the class. So this is the backbone. This is the skeleton. We couldn't do any of what we're doing today in terms of interpretation or understanding these Neanderthals without this kind of thing. Having said that, we won't be reading a whole lot of articles like that. I think that's it today for this video. Tomorrow I'm going to do a video going over all the background material, the chronology, the early hominid lifestyles, all of that. I'll post that tomorrow and I'll see you then. That'll be the 9th of January. All right? Good.